The world has frozen. In Washington, D.C., within the storied walls of the White House, tension crackled like live wires. President Donald Trump, seated at his imposing desk, listened to his advisor Volz as he presented a detailed report on the consequences of withdrawing the United States from NATO. Volz's tone was grave as he outlined the potential unraveling of international alliances and the security risks that loomed large. Yet Trump, dismissive of the warnings, waved off the concerns with a simple, resolute statement. Europe must pay for itself. We are no longer their shield, he declared. His voice, firm and unyielding, reverberated through the room like a clap of thunder, leaving no doubt about his commitment to a radical new course. The announcement sent shockwaves not only through the corridors of power in Washington but across the entire global stage. Thousands of miles away, in Moscow, a different scene unfolded. President Vladimir Putin, in the opulent confines of the Kremlin, raised a glass of champagne with a knowing smile. For years, the Kremlin had harbored ambitions to see NATO's influence wane, and now, with Trump's decision, that long-held dream edged closer to reality. The celebratory gesture was subtle yet loaded with meaning, a silent acknowledgement that the moment to reshape the balance of power had arrived. Meanwhile, in Kiev, the air was thick with apprehension. Ukrainian officials, while aware of the implications of the American withdrawal, braced themselves for what could come next. Intelligence reports had confirmed their worst fears. Without the steadfast support of the United States, Russian military forces would soon seize the opportunity to launch a renewed offensive. In secret briefings, Ukrainian diplomats exchanged anxious looks as they debated how best to counter a potential Russian advance. The looming threat was not just a challenge to Ukrainian sovereignty, it was a harbinger of wider regional instability. The alarm bells were echoed across Eastern Europe. In Poland and the Baltic states, panic quickly gave way to frantic preparation. Government officials in Warsaw and Riga convened emergency sessions, while citizens took to the streets, their voices a mixture of fear and resolve. The prospect of Russian troops mobilizing along their borders pushed these nations into a state of heightened alert. Fortifications were hurriedly reinforced, and contingency plans were drawn up with urgency. The palpable anxiety underscored the fragility of the region's security in the face of such dramatic shifts. In stark contrast, Western Europe found itself paralyzed by indecision. In Berlin and Paris, top leaders were left scrambling to formulate a coherent response to the unfolding crisis. Meetings were held late into the night, yet every discussion seemed mired in uncertainty. The European capitals, long reliant on American military support, now faced the harsh reality of having to depend solely on their own defenses. The political discourse was fraught with tension as policymakers wrestled with the possibility of a divided, isolated Europe, one unable to stand united against a resurgent Russian threat. Back in the Kremlin, the silence was deliberate. As Putin's inner circle gathered in hushed confidence, they meticulously planned the next phase of their strategy. The calm exterior of Moscow belied the fierce ambition simmering beneath. Advisors debated the precise timing and scope of a potential military maneuver, weighing the risks of overreach against the enormous benefits of a weakened NATO. For them, Trump's bold move was not an unforeseen blunder but a calculated opening, a chance to advance Russian interests and shift the global balance of power irrevocably. Inside the White House, the decision's reverberations were just beginning to be felt. The abrupt dismissal of Volz's concerns was more than a political statement. It was a clear signal that American priorities were undergoing a profound transformation. The exit from NATO marked a turning point in U.S. foreign policy, one that promised to redraw the map of global alliances and redefine the nature of international conflict. Advisors whispered among themselves, acutely aware that the coming days would test the limits of diplomatic resolve and military preparedness. In that charged moment, as the echoes of Trump's declaration still reverberated through Washington, the world found itself on the brink of an unprecedented geopolitical upheaval. With Europe now reeling from uncertainty and the Kremlin poised for a decisive maneuver, every nation, from the capitals of power to the smallest border towns, awaited the next move. The stakes were astronomical, and the future was shrouded in peril. Ukrainian intelligence intercepted a disturbing signal during a closed Kremlin reception. Amid hushed conversations, a single phrase echoed, sending shockwaves through the analysts. "He will do everything as we agreed. America will no longer interfere." The cold, Calculated tone of these words hinted at a secret pact capable of shifting the global balance of power. Experts in Kiev were left questioning the true target of this statement and the broader implications for international security. News of the intercepted message spread quickly among Ukrainian diplomats. In emergency meetings in Kiev, officials, already anxious from recent geopolitical shifts, sounded the alarm. They scrutinized the timing and intent behind the declaration, suspecting it marked a new phase in the power struggle among global players. Yet, despite the urgency, Washington remained silent. The lack of response from the American administration deepened suspicions and left Ukrainian diplomats increasingly worried as they attempted to decode the cryptic message and its potential impact on their nation's security. Further revelations emerged from closed negotiations between President Trump and President Putin. Reports confirmed that during these discussions, the topic of Ukraine was deliberately omitted by Trump. This absence suggested that the United States might be complicit in a broader strategy where Ukraine's security was sacrificed for larger geopolitical gains. The deliberate silence on such a critical issue fanned the flames of suspicion, leaving Ukrainian officials to question the true nature of the alliance forming between America and Moscow. At the same time, alarming reports surfaced from Eastern Europe. Intelligence agencies in Poland and Romania detected a significant buildup of Russian military forces along their borders. In Belarus, officials announced large-scale military exercises that, despite being labeled as routine drills, raised suspicions of a potential invasion. The sight of tanks and artillery near key locations sent a clear warning across the region, intensifying fears among neighboring countries about Russia's next move and the possibility of an imminent offensive. Not all in Moscow welcomed these developments. Senior military officials privately expressed concern over the unfolding events. In closed briefings, they warned that a weakened West would embolden China to act more aggressively, creating a dangerous strategic dilemma for Russia. These officers argued that miscalculations could embroil Russia in conflicts on multiple fronts, ultimately isolating Moscow and undermining its security. Their cautious voices revealed a deep uncertainty about the Kremlin's plans and the risks inherent in the current geopolitical maneuvering. In the midst of these converging threats, the situation remained unstable. The intercepted message, Washington's silence, and military movements along Europe's borders combined to create a charged atmosphere of tension and uncertainty. Ukrainian, Russian, and European leaders found themselves navigating dangerous political waters, aware that any misstep could trigger irreversible consequences. With each moment, stakes rose and margins for error shrank. The Kremlin's ominous words continued to echo, serving as a grim reminder of the fragile state of international politics. Amid growing uncertainty, covert channels buzzed with frantic communications. Secret briefings among intelligence agencies detailed unusual troop movements and encrypted messages intercepted from various sources. Analysts worked around the clock to piece together fragments of conversations and coded signals. The emerging picture painted a scenario where hidden agendas were set in motion and alliances were being quietly redefined. Every report intensified the sense of impending crisis, leaving officials and citizens alike on edge as the global balance teetered on the brink of chaos. Tension mounted with every new revelation. As the day drew to a close, the shadow of conspiracy loomed over the continent. Washington's silence, the calculated remarks from Moscow, and the mobilization of troops along Europe's borders pointed to a deliberate maneuver to reshape the global order. Questions remained and doubts persisted. Ukrainian officials braced for what might come next, fully aware that the upcoming hours would be critical for the future of their nation and the region's stability. The decision of the USA to leave NATO began to have unpredictable consequences. Across Europe, unrest surged as citizens took to the streets, demanding that their governments take immediate action to protect national security. In the heart of Warsaw, demonstrators waved banners calling for solidarity and self-reliance, while in London, crowds chanted for a robust response against looming external threats. The shock of America's withdrawal rippled through the continent, igniting a series of protests that underscored a deep-seated fear of an unstable future. In response to the growing public outcry, both Poland and the United Kingdom made a decisive announcement. Leaders from these nations declared the formation of a new military alliance, one designed to counterbalance the power vacuum left by the U.S. departure from NATO. In a joint press conference, Polish Prime Minister Kowalski and British Prime Minister Anderson stressed that the alliance would serve as a collective security measure, ensuring that neither nation would be left vulnerable in an increasingly uncertain geopolitical landscape. Their message was clear: the days of relying solely on American protection were over. Meanwhile, in Berlin, the atmosphere was equally charged. For the first time in a decade, Germany made a dramatic move by announcing a sharp increase in its defense budget. Chancellor Müller emphasized that this boost in military spending was not an act of aggression but a necessary step to safeguard national sovereignty and contribute to a more resilient European security framework. Military analysts interpreted Germany's decision as a signal that Europe was preparing to stand on its own, even if it meant reshaping long-standing alliances. Back in Moscow, the Kremlin was not immune to these seismic shifts. Within its marble halls, whispers of concern began to circulate among the inner circle. In a confidential meeting, one of President Putin's senior advisors broke the silence with a warning that sent a chill through the room. China is making demands, the advisor stated bluntly. They want our resources. If we engage in a major war, they will take advantage of this. His words revealed a hidden layer of complexity in the geopolitical chess game that was unfolding, a reminder that shifting alliances could trigger unexpected challenges from other global powers. The revelation struck a deep chord in Moscow. While many in the Kremlin had long anticipated that the disintegration of NATO might allow Russia to assert its influence, this new development exposed a vulnerability. The possibility that China could exploit the ensuing chaos raised serious questions about the Kremlin's long-term strategy. Military officials and political strategists debated fiercely in hushed tones, weighing the risks of a confrontation on multiple fronts. Some argued for a more cautious approach, while others believed that bold actions were necessary to capitalize on the moment. Yet, the underlying sentiment was one of unease, an acknowledgement that the very chaos they had hoped to harness could spiral beyond their control. In a series of rapid-fire communications, Russian military units were put on high alert. Command centers across Moscow monitored the situation with a mix of anticipation and apprehension. New intelligence reports confirmed that Chinese representatives had begun pressing for concessions in trade and energy deals, hinting that Beijing was positioning itself to benefit from any escalation of conflict. As the pressure mounted, advisors in the Kremlin urged President Putin to reassess his strategy, warning that the current trajectory might lead to unforeseen consequences that could compromise Russia's standing on the world stage. Amid the intensifying crisis, daily life in Russia continued with a veneer of normalcy, but beneath the surface, tension simmered. State media began broadcasting cautious messages about the need for national unity and preparedness, even as backroom discussions revealed a more complex and uncertain reality. Kremlin officials scrambled to anticipate every possible scenario, from renewed military engagements along the European borders to covert diplomatic maneuvers aimed at containing the spread of influence from rival powers. Every decision made in these turbulent hours carried the weight of history. Across continents, leaders were forced to confront the stark reality that the withdrawal of American support was not just a temporary setback, it was a fundamental shift in the global order. The people of Europe, emboldened by their own resolve, were beginning to forge a path towards self-reliance, while Russia faced the daunting challenge of balancing its ambitions with the risk of losing control over the very forces it sought to command. Putin began to understand that the chaos he was creating could also swallow him. The Ukrainian army had been given a clear and urgent order. They were to prepare for a large-scale offensive. Every commander and soldier in the ranks understood that this could be the turning point in the conflict. The message was unambiguous: mobilize all forces, secure defensive positions, and be ready for an attack that could shift the balance of power. Across Ukraine, units drilled, and strategists pored over maps and intelligence reports, each aware that any delay could prove catastrophic. Back in Moscow, President Putin sat in a dimly lit war room, eyes fixed on a series of live feeds and intelligence bulletins. The stakes were higher than ever, and he knew that the moment had arrived. Now or never. For months, he had maneuvered carefully, orchestrating a series of calculated risks to exploit the West's fragmentation following the collapse of NATO. Every move had been part of a larger, secretive plan, but as the Ukrainian forces readied themselves, a new urgency gripped him. It was time to act decisively. At first, the plan seemed to be unfolding as expected. Russian troops began their slow and methodical advance toward key positions along the Ukrainian border. Tanks rolled forward, infantry units mobilized, and artillery positions were established in strategic locations. The Kremlin had long anticipated that this would be the moment to press their advantage and create a new geopolitical reality favorable to Russia. However, as the forces moved into position, an unexpected series of events began to disrupt the carefully orchestrated plan. Without warning, news broke that China had declared economic claims against Russia. In a series of terse, public statements and behind-the-scenes negotiations, Beijing outlined a set of economic demands that would force Moscow to divert attention and resources away from the military campaign. The specifics of these demands were startling. Beijing sought preferential access to Russia's vast natural resources and an expedited reorganization of their trade agreements, threatening to impose severe sanctions if Russia did not comply. This move sent shockwaves through the Russian command structure, as officials scrambled to assess the impact on their strategy. As if that were not enough, reports soon emerged from New Delhi. India, a critical player in the global economic and political arena, began distancing itself from Moscow. High-level meetings in New Delhi and subsequent diplomatic communiques confirmed that India no longer intended to support or engage with Russia in its current course of action. This distancing was not only political but also practical. India was increasingly concerned about the potential fallout from a direct confrontation with Western powers allied with it, as well as with China's aggressive economic posture. Simultaneously, Western countries that had once enjoyed access to Russia's cutting-edge technological advancements and military collaborations abruptly ceased all such cooperation. The tech giants and defense contractors, having sensed the shifting winds, severed ties with Moscow almost overnight. This sudden isolation from technological and economic partners left the Kremlin with few alternatives but to rethink its next move, as vital systems and support networks began to crumble. The situation reached its nadir when a devastating piece of intelligence broke through the Russian high command. In confidential briefings, senior Russian generals revealed that President Trump, contrary to the promises made during earlier secretive talks, had no intention of assisting the Kremlin once NATO had collapsed. The American president's decision was not rooted in a strategic realignment of allied interests but was, in fact, a calculated move in his own game, a move that left Russia exposed and betrayed. The revelation spread through the ranks like wildfire, igniting anger, disbelief, and a profound sense of betrayal among those who had expected a more coordinated international strategy. In the final hours of the maneuver, as the Russian military advanced into contested territories and Moscow's leadership attempted to recalibrate their rapidly disintegrating alliances, the full scope of the new reality became unmistakably clear. Every decision, every calculated risk, now seemed destined to backfire in ways that no one had foreseen. The convergence of unexpected economic pressure from China, diplomatic isolation imposed by India, the technological boycott by the West, and the duplicity of the American president left Russia in an unprecedented predicament. Putin realized that he had fallen into a trap. The Russian military offensive ground to a sudden halt. What had begun as a swift and calculated maneuver to seize the initiative against Ukraine was now mired in unexpected setbacks. As Russian troops stalled at key strategic points, the Ukrainian forces, bolstered by new shipments of advanced weaponry from Europe, began to reassert their defensive positions. The arrival of these arms was a game-changer, infusing the Ukrainian command with fresh hope and tactical options that had not been available in the early days of the conflict. In a stunning geopolitical twist, Beijing stepped into the fray. China, long a silent observer of the escalating crisis, issued an ultimatum to Russia that reverberated across the international community: cease your destabilizing actions, or be prepared to face even more severe consequences. The ultimatum was clear and uncompromising, a signal that China would not tolerate any further actions that threatened global stability. This move not only compounded Russia's strategic challenges, but also sent ripples through Moscow's already strained alliances. Meanwhile, half a world away in the United States, the fallout from President Trump's controversial policies reached fever pitch. Massive protests erupted across major cities as citizens decried his decisions and the resultant abandonment of long-standing alliances. Demonstrators took to the streets with chants and banners, their anger fueled by the perception that their country had forsaken its global responsibilities. The protests were not isolated incidents but part of a broader national reckoning. In Congress, fierce debates ensued, and key legislators moved to sabotage Trump's policies, effectively stalling the administration's unilateral moves on foreign policy. This internal strife further complicated the international landscape, as America's once predictable role in global security was now deeply uncertain. As the chaos unfolded in Washington, NATO itself began to undergo a dramatic transformation. For decades, European nations had relied heavily on American support, but with the United States receding from its commitments, Europe was forced to confront a stark new reality. In emergency meetings held in Brussels and Berlin, European leaders acknowledged for the first time that they must rely solely on their own capabilities. This unexpected process of self-reliance was fraught with both determination and trepidation. Countries like France, Germany, and Italy started to forge deeper bilateral and multilateral ties, forming the foundation of a new, independent European defense architecture, one that signaled a significant departure from decades of dependency on the Atlantic Alliance. Amid these cascading events, a particularly chilling moment unfolded between the two central figures of this international drama. President Trump, still clinging to his personal agenda despite mounting evidence of its consequences, reached out to Vladimir Putin once more. In a terse phone call that encapsulated the deep fractures in their secret understanding, Putin's response was icy and unforgiving. "You used us." Those four words cut through the strained connection, marking the definitive end of any semblance of trust or cooperation between the two leaders. It was a moment that crystallized the betrayal at the heart of Russia's strategy, revealing that the high-stakes game being played by Washington and Moscow was driven by self-interest rather than a shared vision of power. The repercussions of this exchange were immediate and far-reaching. The Kremlin, once a formidable hub of geopolitical influence, found itself increasingly isolated, with America's erstwhile status as the enemy no longer serving as a unifying rallying cry for European nations. The foundation of fear that had bolstered Russian aggression began to crumble. Europe, now awakened to the reality of its own strength, no longer viewed the United States as the ultimate guarantor of security. Instead, each nation was forced to confront its own vulnerabilities and take responsibility for its defense. The ideological and strategic gap that had once allowed Russia to justify its belligerence was rapidly widening. The war that Russia had meticulously prepared as a campaign against Ukraine had, in a cruel twist of fate, transformed into a battle for the very survival of the Russian regime. As isolation deepened and external pressures mounted, the leadership in Moscow was compelled to reassess its position. The long-planned aggressive maneuvers, designed to reshape the global order in Russia's favor, were now proving to be a double-edged sword. The strategic miscalculations and unforeseen alliances among its adversaries had turned what was intended as a show of strength into an existential threat. Inside the Kremlin, senior officials and military commanders scrambled to devise an alternative strategy. Emergency meetings were convened in fortified conference rooms, where the mood was somber and tense. Advisors warned that the international backlash, combined with the internal dissent stirred by the loss of American support, could precipitate a collapse not only of the offensive but of the entire regime's legitimacy. The discussions were pragmatic but grim. Each leader knew that the stakes had never been higher, and that every misstep now carried the risk of igniting an irreversible chain reaction. As the night wore on, the convergence of events painted a stark picture of a new world order in the making. The once carefully orchestrated plans of Moscow had unraveled spectacularly, leaving behind a trail of disillusionment and regret. The international community, galvanized by both economic pressures and a renewed sense of self-reliance, had turned its back on the old dynamics that had long defined global power. The very fabric of alliances was being rewoven, and the implications for future conflicts were profound.